Hi people, it's Archivist here, and welcome to yet another Sekiro Shadows Die Twice boss guide. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Guardian Ape, one of the most terrifying bosses you'll fight in Sekiro. Huge DPS output, particularly on his Perilous Attacks. This large, intimidating stature paired with a very aggressive attack pattern and a rather troubling surprise halfway through. So, in order to beat the Guardian Ape, you need to be patient and look for your openings. There are many times in this fight where you'll think that you've got an opening and it's safe, but he will punish you very quickly if you don't know how aggressive this guy can be. He can move around quickly and damage you as he moves. He can flail around. He can go from a very calm looking stance to just having an absolute temper tantrum, and I think you'll see me get a bit sloppy with that later and get hit. So I'll give you the areas where it's, as I found, usually safe to attack him. The most obvious one is when he does his roar at you from a distance, and if you have the ability unlocked, you can grapple to the sword he has lodged through his neck. Why hasn't that killed him? We'll find out later. And then you can do a spinning attack on his head. It's a very quick way of getting some damage in, and you can back away safely afterwards, and that's a free hit pretty much. Another place I found that can give you pretty much free hits guaranteed as long as you follow the correct pattern is where he does his forward strike. So it begins with this hit here, which is relatively easy to deflect. When he does this, immediately after blocking it, jump behind his head and he'll be lying on the ground and thrashing all over the place. If you go below him, he'll kick you. If you go to his side, he'll obviously punch you. It is possible to deflect, but I tended to go straight to where his head was so that I was safe. And once he stopped flailing about, immediately go to strike him in the head. Now, you can, from what I can see, do this 3 times. However, when you do this, and this goes for a lot of the fight actually, rather than rapidly pressing the attack button, leave about half a second in between strikes. The reason for this, and I don't know if it's intentional or not, is that if you just spam the attack button as quick as you can, the second strike appears to do no damage. But if you leave about half a second in between strikes, you can get 3 clean hits on him. And although in the grand scheme of things it looks like that's not much in his overall health bar, well, it's probably one of the biggest guaranteed safe openers you can do. And it's something that if you want to play this fight safe, just keep looking out for that particular opportunity. So this next opener is a bit of a risky one, and I feel like when they designed this guy, they wanted you to think that this is the perfect opener, but it's just not sometimes, where he will start by thrashing around on the ground and it's relatively easy to get out of the way of or block, and then he will sit up for a moment. Sometimes, and it seems to be dependent on distance you are from him, or it's completely random, but sometimes he will just sit there and that's 2 easy hits to the back, nice and simple. But sometimes he will continue to thrash about, and so going for a strike will lead to you getting hit, and sometimes knocked off balance, and it can do like half your health bar out. This is one where if you want to play this fight safe, you have to resist the urge to go for this, but if you want to be a little bit risky, wait just that slight split second to give him a chance to move on to the secondary attack. If he doesn't, then you can safely go in and do at least 1 solid hit on his back. One attack he does has this giant ape actually gas on you and then throw literally his shit at you. Now, what I found is that you can avoid this ever happening by not standing directly behind him for too long, because he only seems to trigger this attack either if you leave him at a distance for too long and so he just decides to use it, or if you stand behind him basically for too long and then he'll gas on you, run away and throw his shit at you. But what I found I could do was just avoid standing behind him for too long, even though it's tempting because you think that's going to give you some free hits. But by avoiding this, I seem to go through this entire fight without him ever triggering that attack, and that's something I'd recommend doing as well. Avoid standing behind the Guardian Ape at this point for really any more than a second. Get 1 hit if you want, but then jump away immediately. In terms of Perilous Attacks, there are 2 key ones to look out for. One is pretty standard, he just goes down to grab you and you can, well, just jump over it. It's pretty straightforward, just something you have to get used to really. It can catch you out early on when you're not used to it, but I think the moment that instinct comes in, it's a really easy one to get around. One that is, I think it's fair to say, pretty tricky to get around is one he seems to do only in the latter half of his health bar most of the time, where he will run at you and it's telegraphed by this very subtle sort of half standing up animation, and then he jumps up into the air, comes crashing down, grabs you, and by the way, if you move left or right, he can usually still get you, and then he'll smash you into the ground and do massive damage, often one-shotting you. The only way I could find to reliably avoid this attack, because sometimes if I went left or right I'd get out of the way, but the only way to avoid it reliably was to do like a jousting match with him. So if he comes to run at me, I would run at him and then left or right, because then by the time he's in the air, I would often be right behind him. And although he can seemingly sort of move left or right through the air to get to you, one thing he can't do is go backwards. And so the only reliable method I found for avoiding this perilous attack is to get behind him, and I'd recommend trying that as well. Maybe another way that I haven't thought of, but this seems to work. Every now and then he will get into a state where you've done enough damage for him to sort of be submissive for a moment and you get some free strikes, which is nice because if that wasn't the case then his health bar would be so painful to get all the way down, but obviously take advantage of those, and when you do it he'll back off very quickly to get out of the way. You can use this opportunity to very safely take a gold flask and get some health back. Something I didn't do here, but you might want to get some extra damage on him with your shuriken attacks or one of your tools, but I've been trying to focus purely on sword techniques. And then if you rinse and repeat this, get a feel for his strikes. I mean, when it comes to deflecting his regular attacks, quite simply it's a case of just getting used to the pattern. And when you do it, there's a very satisfying kill where you jump on his head and use the sword that was lodged there before to cut his head off. And then you get the shinobi execution screen, and well done. Oh. Well, I suppose if the player can resurrect, it's only fair that bosses can do it, right? But in this particular case, and you can tell that the designer of this was having some fun here, because you even see the shinobi execution screen, which up until this point has signified you've just beaten the boss, but you haven't beaten the boss. There's no save here. You now have a second phase, which is completely different. So this is a far less feral encounter, and I think actually a little bit easier, but it can take longer because it requires some patience, and it's far more, I think, about building up the posture gauge on the enemy, whereas before in the previous fight it's not really practical, it's more about just taking the health down. So first thing to know is this horrible howl attack he does. If you stand in the proximity of this howl for too long, not only do you get a bit of damage, but there's this terror meter that builds up. If that terror meter gets to full, and by the way, if you just stand in it, it will build up immediately. You do just die. You just die regardless of health, you're dead. And if you don't know this is coming, this will kill you on the first attempt. This is one of those things where if you don't know about this fight and you're just coming into it, there's no way that someone doesn't die to this first time. I mean, I know I certainly did. But thankfully, there's a pretty obvious telegraph for this attack where, without wanting to sound too gross, there's this sort of orangey goo that comes out of his neck before he does this attack. The moment you see this, you run. Just hold down the sprint button and you run. Now, I found that I could usually get away with only a sliver of damage and a tiny bit of terror building up, which is a very sustainable way of doing it, but if you're quick enough, you can get away without taking any kind of damage or any kind of terror build up at all. So if you're fast to react to this, you can get away with this scot-free, and then you can run back and do a quick strike on the Guardian Ape in his new horrific form. When he swings his sword at you, his attack patterns are incredibly wild and unwieldy. Just because you're behind him doesn't mean he won't swing his arm right around. So when it comes to openings in this form, you have to be very careful. Only strike when you know he's not doing an attack of any form, because remember, he can just swing around and hit you. One way you can create quite a nice opening is when he raises his sword very high into the air, and the camera almost pans a tiny bit up as well to give this away. If you deflect this successfully, then he will sort of lean forward a bit, and you get quite a few strikes in when you do this. And this is probably the most reliable way of getting some hits in at this phase in the fight. You've also got some perilous attacks, one where he just sweeps across the ground, definitely get out of the way of it, just jump, or you can even move backwards, but I would recommend jumping. Another one where he goes super high into the air, lingers there for just a moment, and then you see the flash, and when you see this, jump, because he'll sweep the whole ground. This is definitely a jump one because it's really hard to get away from him in time. He can somehow just get to you and hit you. If you go far enough away, sometimes he will run at you, jump on the ground, slide and strike you with his sword. This is quite an easy one though. You can either jump over it or you can block it, and you can see it coming a mile off, and then you can go in for some hits. In this phase, it's far more appropriate and even recommended to strike him from behind. He doesn't have that same annoying gas attack. So if you can stay behind him in this point, it is a bit better. And I even found that if you are behind him, it's a little bit easier to get out of the range of his Howl Attack. And if you just make sure that you don't underestimate how wild his sword attacks can be, so constantly be blocking and deflecting that. If you choose your openings wisely, and above absolute all else, when you see that spew come out of him and he's ready to do that howl, you run. Just run. It's the key to this fight. You cannot ignore that. You have to do it, otherwise you will die. You can't heal through it. There is an item that reduces terror, but if you do it right, you won't actually need that. And after what it feels like a very, very long fight, this bit took me quite some time to do, just in terms of whittling his health down. You can finally do the killing blow, and I was certainly paranoid that there'd be something else after this, but thankfully there's finally a shred of mercy coming from the designer, and the fight's over. You have defeated the Guardian Ape, and he's not coming back. Well, at least not this one. In terms of my enjoyment for this fight, it's a bit of a funny one, because I definitely had initially that feeling of this is too tricky, and when I defeated his first phase and he got up, I didn't kind of sit back and thought, oh, that's clever, or I didn't see that coming. I did think, oh my god, there's another part to this fight. And the fact that it takes just as long to defeat that second phase, and the fact he has that death howl which can just kill you in seconds if you don't get out of the way, it did have that moment of frustration to it. There's just no way of getting around that. I did find it frustrating. But I think after taking some time to learn where my openings were in this fight, and not to just go for an attack whenever I thought I could, but to see where am I actually safe to hit, it becomes a lot easier. And indeed, when I did my recording on this fight that you're seeing on screen that I'm using to demonstrate, I didn't even need to resurrect. I got hit majorly at one point and I had to use my health potion, but other than that I was generally okay. But without a shred of a doubt, on my initial playthrough of fighting this guy, he was a wall. There are a few points in this game where I would say I hit the wall on it and was wondering, will I ever beat this person? And that was probably the Chained Ogre at the beginning, because I thought, like, I can't believe how hard this game has gotten already. Then there was the Guardian Ape, as you're seeing here, and then the final boss. Oh god, that took me forever. But that final boss, funnily enough, teaches you how each of these other bosses does have a way of beating them, so long as you are willing to learn the mechanics, and everything that seems unfair will usually have some way of getting around it, I find. And if you find that a response to an attack is a bit unreliable, I would wager that there is probably another way of doing it. For example, in this Guardian Ape's first phase, when he does that leap attack at you to grab you, I was always trying to dodge left or right, and he would grab me anyway, and I thought, this is just unfair. I can't believe how unreliable my dodges and my jumps are in this. But the moment I thought, wait, what if I actually get behind him and I run so that he can't grab me? Well, now I have a very reliable way of being able to get behind him, and really the only challenge then becomes your own speed and your own ability to identify that that attack is coming, so that you can prepare yourself both mentally and in terms of the positioning of your character. I also do like defeating these enemies if I can without a resurrection, why not, it's pretty cool, and also without using any of the arm tools, just because it feels like a more pure way of doing it if I can beat the boss purely through using my sword. And that's what I tried to do here. I don't think I ever used the shurikens that I was tempted to use, because you can, and I would recommend doing this if you want to beat the Guardian Ape. Just unload all of your shurikens into him, because that will do, if you get all of them in, a decent amount of damage. And also, of course, there are certain candies you can use to boost your damage, which are definitely good during the second phase, because it just goes on for so long with your standard attack strength. So those have been both a guide, hopefully, to help you, and also a little review at the end here for the Guardian Ape fight. If you have any questions for areas I haven't actually talked about during this video, I am more than happy to answer them if you comment below. As always people, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.